Welcome everyone. My name is Katherine Johnson and I've been asked again by the World Mediation Organisation to do a follow-up on the first video that we did about my books, and this one is about how we are using those books for nation building through mediation. We're talking about the Mongolia experience. The aim of the talk is to demonstrate the scope that dispute resolution and mediation in particular can have to become an agent for social change. I'll discuss how our experiences with our partner Mongolian organisations assisted them to strengthen their work with Mongolian families and by default to also strengthen their civil society. The project began 3 years ago in March 2017 when I accompanied my brother, Konstantin Pavlidis, to Mongolia during a documentary he was making about the life of Lama Natsak Dorj, a key Lama in Mongolia. The documentary, called The Wisdom Keepers, won an award and was a follow-up on the one that he had successfully completed in Australia about Max Dulamunmun Harrison, an elder of the Yuin people and a traditional keeper of the wisdom of the ancients. As both the Mongolian and the Australian Aboriginal cultures were First Nations people, there were similarities to be drawn about their traditional links to the land and the knowledge or wisdom they gained from that connection. What was of special relevance to me was whether the connection to the land had any impact on resolving disputes. That is, I was fascinated about how First Nation cultures resolved their internal disputes before the advent of any external influences, and how they now resolve their relational issues, both economic and personal, after external influences. Having explained my interest to Lama Natsak Dorj, he suggested that I should meet with Professor Namgil from Ulaanbaatar University. That meeting with Professor Namgil set the course of action for the next 3 years. Initially, Professor Namgil asked if I could accompany him to Erdenet City, a mining town about 300 kilometres from Ulaanbaatar, to address a group of 150 men who had requested his assistance about how best to look after their children now that they were left widowed or divorced, or were either disabled or unemployed, or both. Professor Namgil said that he had never before had such a request, and the fact that the men were sufficiently well organised to approach him made him committed to assist them. Professor Namgil mentioned that it was not uncommon in Mongolia for women to be better educated than the men due to their nomadic tradition, where boys were kept behind to assist with the movement of the ger, that is their felt home, during the different seasons. But women could be sent away to gain their education as a means of assisting the overall welfare of the family. He mentioned that in recent years this was causing a severe problem in society in cases where the men felt that their traditional skills of horsemanship and herding were no longer useful in an urban setting. The feeling of disempowerment in the men led to depression and in many cases alcohol abuse and domestic violence, particularly in the mining towns where unemployment was also a problem. As the women were better educated and thus more confident than the men, they would separate from their husbands and sometimes separate from their children to travel to wherever there were better jobs. This behaviour in a transitional society caused a high level of divorce in recent years due to the lack of personal and cultural skills with which to address those underlying relational issues. At first, I was rather daunted by Professor Namgil's request and suggested that a better option would be that I return to Australia, put together a team of Australian mediators with whom I could return to Mongolia to conduct a comprehensive needs analysis about the best way forward. Professor Namgil agreed, and by August 2017, I had recruited a group of 4 facilitator mediators with whom I could return to Mongolia to conduct a comprehensive needs analysis about the best way forward. These were Mary Walker, Lauren Spool, Jennifer Scott, and Helen Majinski, assisted me with conducting the needs analysis in Mongolia. I also asked Jennifer's husband, Ian Scott, who is an international director of Rotary, to join us because he was able to secure Rotary funding for our training program in July 2019. The project was therefore indebted to Rotary and especially to Ian for the excellence in translating our written and our oral work for the program. In addition, I recruited 2 rapporteurs, namely Andrew Wong and Jessica Walker, who recorded the attendance and outcomes of all our meetings that were held during our needs analysis in March 2018. It was on the strength of their reports that it was possible to complete the application for funding in 2019 via Rotary. The program is therefore also indebted to our rapporteurs, without whose reports we would not have secured any funding. Including myself, this made a delegation of 8, all of whom had very particular expertise and were international speakers prepared to pay their own way to assist pro bono in what we saw to be a very important project. So in March 2018, all 8 of us, known as the Mongolian delegation, ventured into the freezing temperatures of Mongolia for 2 weeks to conduct our needs analysis. We were delighted to be warmed by the wonderful hospitality, the generosity of spirit and willingness to learn of the Mongolian organisations that we met. The 2 major organisations that requested assistance, along with the men from Erdenet City, were the Judicial Council of Mongolia and the National Family, Youth and Child Development Authority of Ulaanbaatar. The Judicial Council of Mongolia is the official government organisation through which the training and accreditation of mediators in Mongolia occurs. The Director of Mediation for the Judicial Council, Ichin Koglu Ragcha, who calls herself Iho, was the first to recognise and set in motion the need for further training of the Judicial Council mediators, especially in relation to family law matters. The National Family, Youth and Child Development Authority, on the other hand, is also a government department of psychologists and social workers and administrators working with Mongolian families on a grassroots level, who also recognise the need to train their members in mediation and conflict resolution skills to better assist separating and/or divorcing Mongolian families. Our needs analysis in 2018 revealed that training mediators in Mongolia has only occurred during the last 5 years, and that the whole process of introducing mediation in Mongolia was less than 10 years old. The method of training was originally provided through the Japan International Cooperation Agency, otherwise known as JICA, which uses the traditional facilitation model that was quite successfully implemented for use with commercial matters and with labour law matters. In commercial and labour law matters, the mediator receives a percentage of the proceeds for those matters that reach agreement. The same percentage for mediators was also to apply for family law matters, but unfortunately, the JICA model was not successful for family law matters, having only reached a success rate of 12% in March 2018. The JICA model also did not address the large problem of domestic violence and alcohol abuse, especially amongst the mining towns such as Erdenet City, from where the 150 men seeking assistance came. Both organisations, through the Judicial Council and the National Family, Youth and Child Development, recognised that the problem of dealing with the types of issues expressed by the Erdenet men needed a different approach. Both organisations were constrained by their own statements of duties, which made cooperation between them somewhat strained, as is the case in any country where organisations work independently in silos. Another outcome of our needs analysis in 2018 was to recognise that part of the lack of success in family law matters was the fact that there is no Mongolian word for mediation, the closest being reconciliation. This gave the mediators of the Judicial Council and the psychologists, social workers of the National Authority the impression that the aim of mediation was to reconcile the parties so that they did not divorce. We realised, therefore, that this interpretation also had to be addressed as part of our training program for 2019. So a major part of our developing our training program came from the request by the Judicial Council's Director of Mediation, Iho, to come to Australia in August 2018 with 2 of her regional mediators, one close to the border of China, which was Mungo, and the other close to Erdenet City, which was Elbek. Iho stated that she and her team had conducted a lot of research worldwide into family law issues to see how countries around the world were rated, and was very pleased to inform us that despite all the difficulties we notice in Australia with our family law system, Australia has a gold star rating for its family law on a worldwide scale. She therefore wanted to know how Australia dealt with its family law problems, and to find out, she organised a stay at my home in Sydney for 8 days in August 2018. During that time, Helen Majinski organised a series of meetings with the family law courts and family relations centres in Greater Sydney, which served as the blueprint for the Mongolian delegation to decide how best they should proceed. Our needs analysis in 2018 and Iho's visit provided a background template on which we began to build our training program, which we aim to deliver in July 2019. The date for the training was chosen at Iho's request to coincide with Nadam, Mongolia's most significant festival of the year. Coincidentally, the Australian National Mediation Conference, which is a biannual event, was also being held in April 2019 in Canberra. And when Ulji, the head of the National Youth, Family and Child Development Authority, found this out, she agreed to come to Australia for 2 weeks to address the Australian National Mediation Conference about Mongolian family law. Ulji attended with 3 of her assistants, Sana, who was responsible for organising the men from Erdenet and persuaded them to contact Professor Namgil, Padma, a psychologist who was in charge of making submissions to the relevant minister for changes to the Mongolian family law system, and Engtuya, their interpreter. So after 2 Mongolian delegations visited Australia, one in August 2018 from the Judicial Council and one in April 2019 from the authority, we finally put together a workbook based on my doctorate in law, which I completed in 2015 and published in 2018, called The Reconstructionist Model of Mediation, Making Sense of Loss. These are the 2 books of which I spoke in that first video that we did for the World Mediation Organization. My doctorate was about the significance of educating the parties about empathy and relational responsibility in an intake process in mediation. It was based on the information session used by the mediation unit in the Sydney Registry of the Family Court in the early 1990s that was put together by Di Gibson, who was then in charge of that mediation unit and registrar of that unit. Being a psychologist, Di recognised the significance of acknowledging loss and acknowledging the impact of ongoing grief over any loss on the decision-making capacity of the parties in family law matters. She realised that unless the loss was acknowledged, that the parties would not be ready to move forward with any agreement that would be satisfactory on a long-term basis. With permission, I modified the original information session of the Family Court to include a normative approach, and I have used the modified version successfully for the last 25 years in all manner of mediations to build relational responsibilities between disputing parties. It was therefore recognised as part of our needs analysis in 2018 that teaching this model to the mediators of the Judicial Council and teaching it to the psychologists and social workers of the National Authority would be the best way to meet their current needs. The idea was to share the information from psychology about the normative information session, which we've termed the NIS, during the intake process in family law matters, which the Judicial Council and the National Authority could then adapt, adopt, or otherwise modify to suit their ongoing needs. Information about conflict resolution and conflict management were also added, mainly by Jennifer Scott, to form a very comprehensive workbook, which was over 70 pages, and which was then translated into Mongolian with the assistance of Rotary funding. The whole training program lasted 9 days. 3 days with the authority, where we trained about 66 delegates, 1 day with the 22 men from Erdenet City, and then 5 days with the 44 mediators of the Judicial Council. The training delivered by all 5 of us, as mediator trainers working in unison with each other, was delivered, by all 5 of us. And as educators, we used a variety of teaching methods such as role plays, live panel discussions, a take-home exam, and exercises where difficult Mongolian family law matters were discussed as case studies in detail in small groups and class activities. Using exercises such as the DISC,
to discuss different communication styles, transactional analysis model, to discuss the significance of empathy, the mindfulness model, to discuss the need for focused presence, to name a few. The various were part of the normative information session from my handbook for practitioners, which we demonstrated experientially to ensure that learning became culturally appropriate. We were extremely pleased to be told via feedback at the end of our training that the different training methods of each of the 5 of us and our different styles of presentation added to the whole learning experience of the groups. Like each finger contributes to the working of a hand, despite its difference from the others. But what about the men from Erdenet? Well, to my great satisfaction, the training day for the 22 men who were transported with Rotary's assistance from Erdenet City to Ulaanbaatar was very successful. The group of 22 men constituted almost 1/3 of the 150 who originally requested assistance more than 18 months earlier. The significance of their problem was therefore demonstrated by the sheer number of those who actually attended the training, which was conducted by Lawrence Bull and 2 men from Ulaanbaatar. One of the male trainers ran a very much loved radio program with which the men in the majority of the Mongolian population in Ulaanbaatar were very familiar. And the other, who was very involved with Rotary, developed an online support system to assist families and especially single fathers with autistic children. Through sharing stories together without the presence of women, the men understood the significance of fatherhood, not only individually as fathers with their own children, but also collectively as a guiding principle to the development of a nation. They appreciated that the more they could develop and utilize their own guiding principles for what it means to be a father in modern-day Mongolia, the more they could develop their own personal and cultural identity from being a man and father in a nomadic culture to being a man and father in an urbanized Mongolian culture. The fact that they realize that they still hold responsibility for the relations they foster within their respective families and with each of their family members meant that they felt empowered to make decisions that could benefit themselves and their children, despite their obvious loss of their original identity as herdsmen. They acknowledged that the loss of their identity from nomadic to urban culture and the loss of their personal link to the land contributed to their sense of depression and uncontrolled anger, which led to incidents of domestic violence and alcohol abuse. But they also realised that with the ongoing support from the social workers and psychologists from the authority, and with the support of Professor Namgil and the 2 Mongolian men involved in their training, they could now go back to Erdenet City and encourage the remaining men to similarly self-empower. The fact also that there was a plan made by Professor Namgil, who introduced the training day for the men, to review what is happening in Erdenet in September 2019 and to begin the development of the Family Relations Centre, where men can gather to support and assist each other with their respective problems, gave enormous hope and built great enthusiasm amongst the men for a better future. Professor Namgil also gave an undertaking to support the men's projects and, where possible, to encourage his social work and psychology students from Ulaanbaatar University to work with the men as part of their future ongoing support. They also reconsidered the value of not just educating the girls, as was the traditional practice, but also now consider educating the boys. In short, then, there were 3 parts to the training. The first was based around training the 66 or so psychologists and social workers from the Family, Youth and Child Development Authority in basic mediation skills, not as mediators, but as facilitators, so that they could better understand how to let the parties make their own decisions instead of using their traditional approach to give advice in relation to staying married. This required a new definition for them to adopt about mediation, not as reconciliation, but as joint parenthood. The second training was with the 22 men from Erdenet, who were the main reason for the project in the first place, and as stated above, was very satisfactorily conducted without the presence of women. It was very satisfying to know that through Professor Namgil's ongoing social work course at Ulaanbaatar University, the men's program engendered enough ongoing support to continue their self-empowerment process once they returned to Erdenet City. The last was the training with the Judicial Council, where we trained all 44 of the mediators of Mongolia and some of the family law judges in the intake process for family law, using my NIS method, which focuses on developing empathy and relational responsibility between the parties in dispute. In other words, the mediators were given advanced training in the psychology behind dispute resolution in relation to family law. The premise for the whole training program for all three groups was based on the Geneva Convention for the Rights of the Child. That is, that each child has the right to have a good relationship with its mother and to have a good relationship with its father. With that premise in mind, the men in Erdenet were able to understand that despite being separated or divorced, they still had a responsibility, as did their ex-wives, to remain parents to their children, and that meant that they still had a significant role as fathers to provide guidance to their children and have a good relationship despite losing their original identity. In other words, they still had the responsibility to determine what form their identity would take as modern fathers to their children in a transitional Mongolian society. The authority, on the other hand, recognised that their focus had to change from being an advisory body to becoming a body that teaches Mongolian families how to better use conflict resolution and conflict management skills. The authority was also given the task of making recommendations to the minister about developing a separate family court, as Australia has done, and recognised that better training of the psychologists and social workers was needed to use conflict management and conflict resolution skills with their clients to better assist divorcing and or separating families. In relation to the trained mediators and judges of the family law from the Judicial Commission, using my handbook as guidelines for practitioners, which outlined the use of the NIS in the mediation process, enabled them to better understand the psychological needs of the parties underlying the dispute and to therefore better acknowledge the extent of each party's loss. It also enabled them to better assist the disputing parties with their readiness to move forward, to create a stronger Mongolian families, and by default to create a stronger civil society with which to build the nation of their choice. This year, 2020, Mongolia holds its democratic elections. Since our training, both the National Authority and the Judicial Council have recognised that despite all the difficulties of having a separate family court, as discussed by the Australian experience, they believe that the benefits outweigh the disadvantages and have therefore recommended to their ministers the establishment of a separate family court in Mongolia. Part of that election process will be to hold election discussions about the recommendations for that reason. And we believe our training has been somewhat instrumental in leaning towards that direction. When in Australia, both the National Authority and the Judicial Council delegates were introduced by Helen Majinsky and I to the Greater Sydney Family Law Pathway Network. Briefly, the purpose of the Sydney's network is for the disparate groups in the Greater Sydney region dealing with family law to collaborate via a government grant to educate the public at large about the mediation process. When I was asked in Mongolia how best the Mongolian government could assist Mongolian families, it was suggested that perhaps a similar government initiative could occur in Mongolia, where the government would issue a grant of funds along with an invitation to both the Judicial Council and the National Family, Youth and Child Development Authority to work together to educate the Mongolian public at large about the mediation process and about the child's right to maintain a good relationship with both its parents as part of the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. The Greater Sydney Family Law Pathway Network, of which Helen is the president in 2020, has been a wonderful inspiration and a means of networking that has greatly benefited the family dispute resolution industry in Sydney. We believe that such a network may similarly benefit Mongolia in years to come when they develop their own version. Such a joint project, funded by the Mongolian government, could assist the organisations involved in family law to continue with their current statements of duties, but also enables them to cooperate as joint members of a joint project designed to strengthen Mongolian families and designed to build a nation with more tolerance for its divorced or separated families through the mediation process. For now, there are plans for the Mongolian delegation, including Professor Namgil, Iho from the Judicial Council, and Ulchi from the National Authority, to attend the next National Mediation Conference in Australia in Alice Springs in September 2021. This will be the first international First Nations conference for mediators, and we are all looking forward to learning from the wisdom of our First Nations cultures as they continue to define their own identity in an increasingly globalised world. Given that Mongolia is one of the few First Nations people who actually govern their own country and have done so as a democracy for about 30 years following perestroika after Russian rule, they are still very keen to refine their system to one that best suits their evolving national identity in a globalised world. Similarly, we are very keen to learn from them what criteria in civil society they consider to be fundamental to the development of a modern nation with limited resources that can survive and thrive in a fast-moving, technological and globalised world. A conference such as the one planned for the National Mediation Conference in Alice Springs in 2021 will enable such learning to be shared, and given the excitement of our Mongolian parties to attend that conference, it seems that this project will continue and that there will be further chapters to this story which will demonstrate that dispute resolution and mediation in particular can be an agent for social change. Thank you very much. I hope you find this a worthwhile talk.